At exactly 6:42 p.m., I watched my mother smooth the front of her emerald green dress before turning toward me for the first time in 9 years. I was 34 years old, the founder of a small educational nonprofit, and standing at my younger sister Emma's wedding with a silver stethoscope keychain tucked inside my coat pocket. My grandfather had given it to me when I was 12, saying, "Whatever heals people deserves respect." He never lived long enough to see what happened after he died. Across the ballroom, my mother looked directly into my eyes, whispered something I couldn't hear, and the champagne glass in her hand slipped onto the marble floor. That shattered glass wasn't the moment everything changed. It was only the moment everyone else finally noticed. What my mother didn't know that evening was that the story had begun almost a decade earlier, with a single sentence that quietly erased me from my own family and forced me to build an entirely different life. I grew up believing my family loved medicine more than they loved one another. My father was a cardiologist. My mother was a pediatric surgeon. Emma became a neurologist before turning 30. Every hallway in our house displayed framed diplomas beside polished hospital awards. During family dinners, conversations revolved around difficult operations, medical conferences, or new research papers. The silver stethoscope keychain from my grandfather was treated almost like a sacred family symbol. Everyone assumed I would someday carry a real one. The problem was simple. I never wanted to become a doctor. I loved teaching. While everyone else memorized anatomy textbooks, I volunteered at community literacy centers every Saturday morning. I believed changing someone's future through education mattered just as much as repairing a broken bone or treating a failing heart. My grandfather understood that before anyone else did. Whenever he visited, he asked about the students I tutored instead of my biology grades. He remembered every child's name. He once drove 42 miles just to attend a reading competition where one of my students won second place. On my 18th birthday, he handed me the silver stethoscope keychain and smiled. "It isn't for becoming a doctor," he said quietly. "It's to remind you that healing comes in more than one form." After he passed away 2 years later, nobody mentioned those words again. Instead, my mother polished the keychain every January and placed it beside family photographs of doctors in white coats, as if she could rewrite what Grandpa had meant. Looking back now, the painful truth is that I helped normalize what happened next. Whenever relatives asked why I wasn't applying to medical school, I laughed before anyone else could. When my mother introduced Emma as our future star surgeon and introduced me simply by my first name, I smiled politely. When family friends asked whether I had changed my mind yet, I answered with jokes because silence felt easier than disagreement. I wasn't simply mistreated. I participated in making my own place smaller because I believed acceptance had to be earned. By the time I was 25, I had accepted a position managing educational programs for underserved schools. The salary wasn't impressive, but every evening I came home believing I had improved someone's future. I rented a tiny apartment with secondhand furniture, drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic, and never regretted my decision. My family saw something different. To them, I had wasted my intelligence. When Emma announced her engagement, I received an invitation 3 weeks later than everyone else. Even then, I called twice, emailed once, and confirmed with both my father and my aunt that I would attend the engagement dinner. I still have those emails today because somewhere inside me I already expected something to go wrong. "Everything's settled," my father wrote on March 18th at 8:11 p.m. "We'll see you Saturday," my aunt texted the following morning. I printed both messages. Maybe I already knew I would need proof. The night before that dinner, my mother phoned while I was finishing lesson plans for Monday's classes. "You understand how important appearances are," she said calmly. I laughed awkwardly because I thought she was talking about dress code. Then she repeated the sentence I had heard in different forms my entire life. "Our family doesn't celebrate ordinary people." I remember dismissing it as another passing remark. I wish I hadn't. At exactly 7:16 p.m. the following evening, my phone vibrated while I stood in my apartment kitchen wrapping Emma's wedding gift. It was a text from my mother. 14 words changed the direction of my life. "Don't come tomorrow. It will confuse people. Our family doesn't celebrate ordinary people." I stared at the message for almost 3 minutes before reading it again. The handmade oak memory box I had spent 6 weekends building for Emma sat open on the dining table beside neatly folded tissue paper. Inside it were scanned childhood photographs, handwritten recipes from our grandmother, and a letter I had written wishing her a joyful marriage. The finished gift looked strangely alive against the cold light from my phone. In one room sat years of careful effort. In my hand rested the sentence that declared none of it mattered. I called my father at 7:24 p.m. He answered on the fourth ring. "I already know," he said before I spoke. "You knew." There was a long pause. "Just give your mother some time." That was all. No argument. No invitation. No explanation. I placed the phone face down beside the memory box and listened to the refrigerator humming in the silence. Somehow that ordinary sound hurt more than shouting would have. The next morning I drove 41 miles anyway. Not to attend the engagement dinner. Just to leave the gift with the hotel receptionist. The young woman behind the desk smiled warmly and promised it would reach Emma before the celebration started. She never knew she was witnessing someone quietly returning her place in a family. I didn't cry until I reached the parking garage. Even then it lasted less than a minute. When I finally composed myself, I realized the worst part wasn't the rejection. It was how familiar it felt. Driving home, old memories arranged themselves differently. The science fair where my artwork received a state award, but dinner conversations lasted 2 hours discussing Emma's biology competition. The afternoon I earned my teaching certification, only to hear my mother ask whether it was too late to apply to medical school. The Christmas when every doctor in the family received engraved leather bags while I opened a bookstore gift card with no name written inside. None of those moments had seemed large enough to matter by themselves. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The uncomfortable truth was that I hadn't only been their victim. Every time I smiled through another insult. Every time I laughed to make everyone comfortable. Every time I accepted being introduced as Emma's sister instead of by my own accomplishments. I helped teach everyone, including myself, that my place at the table was negotiable. For years I believed patience would eventually earn respect. Instead, patience simply made disrespect feel normal. A week later I met my cousin Daniel for coffee. He listened quietly until I finished telling him everything. Then he sighed. "You know how Aunt Linda is," he said. "Don't make this into something bigger." Those 7 words felt almost identical to my mother's text. The following Sunday, I visited my Aunt Rebecca, hoping someone in the family would finally admit what had happened was wrong. She squeezed my hand across the kitchen table before saying, "Emma's wedding only happens once." Sometimes the peaceful choice is staying silent. Peaceful. That word stayed with me all afternoon. Silence had never created peace. It had only protected the person causing the harm. 3 days later, I stopped by the Community Literacy Center where I volunteered after work. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the 70-year-old director who had known me since college, noticed immediately that something was wrong. She didn't interrupt. She didn't excuse anyone. She waited until I finished speaking. Then she looked directly at me and asked one simple question. "If they never change, how many more years are you willing to spend asking permission to belong?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because for the first time in my life, someone had quietly given me permission to imagine that belonging might exist somewhere else. Mrs. Brooks' question followed me for weeks. I answered it silently every morning while driving to work, every evening while unlocking the door to my apartment, and every Sunday when I caught myself wondering whether anyone from home would call. No one did. Exactly 31 days after my mother's text, I wrote one final email to both of my parents. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a demand. I offered the smallest compromise I could imagine. "I don't need an apology today," I wrote. "I'd simply like to meet for coffee. No arguments, no discussion about careers. Just 1 hour together. We can start over as a family." I reread it 5 times before pressing send at 9:03 a.m. For 2 days, there was no response. On the 3rd morning, my mother finally replied. The email contained only 87 words. She never acknowledged the engagement dinner. She never mentioned the text message. Instead, She wrote that families depended on shared values and that I had chosen a path that embarrassed generations of physicians. Then came the sentence I already knew by heart. Our family doesn't celebrate ordinary people. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she truly believed repeating the same sentence could erase my life. Her message ended with an ultimatum. If I wanted to rebuild our relationship, I needed to apply to medical school within the year, stop wasting my potential in education, and publicly admit I had made a mistake. Otherwise, she warned, relatives would stop inviting me to family events, Emma would distance herself from me, and I couldn't blame anyone except myself for the consequences. It read less like a mother's letter and more like a contract. For the first time, I noticed something important. There wasn't a single sentence asking whether I was happy. Not one. That afternoon, I sat alone on a park bench with Grandpa's silver stethoscope keychain resting in my palm. The metal had become dull after years of carrying it everywhere. I rubbed it with my thumb and remembered his voice. Whatever heals people deserves respect. Suddenly the choice became simple. I had spent 25 years trying to earn a seat at a table where my worth would always be measured against someone else's title. No amount of achievement would ever change the rules because the rules themselves were broken. That evening I stopped fighting for a better place inside my family system. Instead, I decided to build a life where no ranking system existed at all. The thought felt strangely peaceful. I accepted additional responsibilities at the nonprofit. Within 18 months, I was directing literacy programs across 3 counties instead of 1. Our budget grew from $185,000 to nearly $640,000. More than 900 students entered the program during my second year. Parents began recognizing me at grocery stores. Former students mailed handwritten graduation announcements. No newspaper described me as extraordinary. I didn't need them to. Every child who learned to read fluently became proof that healing didn't always happen inside an operating room. The old ache didn't disappear overnight. Birthdays still arrived without phone calls. Christmas mornings remained painfully quiet. Sometimes I found myself opening old family photographs before quickly putting them away again. Success could build a future. It couldn't replace history. Still, I made one promise to myself. If anyone from my family ever decided to return honestly, not to evaluate me, not to rank me, not to change me, I would leave the door unlocked. Not because they deserved another chance. Because I refused to become the kind of person who measured love the way they had. 9 years passed faster than I expected. One Tuesday morning, at exactly 8:27 a.m., an unfamiliar email appeared in my inbox. The subject line contained only 4 words. Emma's wedding invitation. I stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't pretending the past had never happened. She simply wrote that she hoped I would come. Nothing more. I opened a blank reply. My first draft lasted exactly 1 sentence. Asterisk, 9 years is a long time to remember I exist. Asterisk. I deleted it. The second draft was even harsher. Asterisk, tell mom she can save everyone the embarrassment by pretending I declined. Asterisk. I highlighted every word and pressed delete again. Neither message would change the past. Neither sounded like the person I had spent 9 years becoming. So I closed my eyes, took one slow breath, and wrote the only response I could live with. Asterisk, thank you for inviting me. I'll be there on Saturday. I wish you every happiness as you begin this new chapter. Asterisk. I clicked send at 8:46 a.m. 34 minutes later, my mother replied. Only 5 words appeared beneath the forwarded invitation. Asterisk, don't expect anything to change. Asterisk. For the first time in nearly a decade, those words no longer frightened me. They simply confirmed that I had already built a life strong enough to survive hearing them again. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday in early October. I arrived at St. Andrew's Chapel at 3:18 p.m., 10 minutes before the ceremony. The silver stethoscope keychain rested inside my coat pocket exactly where Grandpa had always told me to keep it, close enough to remember who I was, but never where anyone else could decide what it meant. People recognized me slowly. A few cousins hesitated before walking over. An uncle I hadn't seen in years shook my hand and quietly said, "I've heard about your literacy foundation. Congratulations." No one mentioned medicine. No one asked why I had left. For the first time in my life, conversations with my relatives felt almost ordinary. Emma found me before the ceremony began. She hugged me for several seconds without saying much. When she finally stepped back, she smiled. "I read every letter you sent over the years," she whispered. That surprised me. I had assumed my parents had thrown them away. "I wasn't brave enough then," she admitted. "I'm trying to be now." That was enough. Some apologies don't arrive as speeches. Sometimes they arrive simply as someone choosing to stand beside you. Later that evening, during the reception, several guests approached me after learning about the nonprofit. One father introduced me to his daughter, who struggled with reading. Another guest offered to sponsor scholarships. By the end of the night, our organization had received nearly $28,000 in unexpected donations from people I had never met before. The work my family once dismissed was changing lives right in front of them. Ironically, the loudest praise came from people who owed me nothing. A cousin quietly told me afterward that the reception itself had felt strangely different. The doctors gathered at one table discussing promotions, research grants, and hospital politics. The conversations were polished, respectful, predictable. Meanwhile, the dance floor filled with teachers, neighbors, volunteers, former students, and children laughing without worrying who held the most impressive title. Neither gathering was cruel. One simply felt alive. For a brief moment, I caught my mother watching everything from across the ballroom. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching everyone else looking at me. 9 years earlier, that realization would have felt like victory. Instead, it felt sad. Because no amount of admiration from strangers could return the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays we had lost. Success had repaired my confidence. It hadn't repaired time. Near the end of the reception, my father quietly approached. His hair had turned almost completely gray. "I should have answered differently that night," he said. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't enough. But it was honest. Then he told me something I had never known. After Grandpa died, my mother became terrified that everything their family had sacrificed would disappear with the next generation. Medicine became more than a profession to her. It became proof that their struggles had meant something. Understanding that didn't erase what she had done. Pain explained is still pain. A wound doesn't disappear simply because you finally learn how it happened. Almost everyone had left by 10:41 p.m. when the hotel coordinator told me someone was waiting outside the reception hall. It was my mother. She hadn't come to congratulate me. She hadn't come to apologize. She simply stood there alone. I greeted her politely before asking the coordinator to finish clearing the ballroom first. She waited nearly 20 minutes. For once, the pace of the conversation belonged to me. When we finally sat down in the empty lobby, she reached for the familiar arguments. "You've always been too sensitive." I didn't answer. A minute later, she tried another. "You misunderstood what I wanted for you." Again, I stayed quiet. Neither sentence carried the weight it once had. Eventually, the silence did what arguing never could. Her shoulders relaxed. She looked older than I remembered. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Did you ever stop loving us?" I looked at the marble floor for several seconds before answering. "No." Another silence settled between us. She nodded slowly. "I don't know how to fix 9 years." "You don't start with me," I replied. "You start with Emma." She spent years trapped between loyalty and fear. She deserves the apology before I do. She didn't argue. She simply stood up and walked toward the garden where Emma had stepped outside with her husband a few minutes earlier. I didn't follow. What they said to each other belongs to them. I only know they remained there together for almost half an hour. When they returned, both of them had been crying quietly. No dramatic speeches followed. No miraculous reconciliation happened overnight. Some conversations are too sacred to become stories. 1 year later, our family gathered again. Not at a hospital banquet. Not beneath framed medical diplomas. We met at the Community Literacy Center where dozens of children proudly read books aloud to their parents. That became our new tradition. Each autumn, every family member volunteered for one Saturday. Doctors checked children's vision. Teachers organized reading circles. Engineers repaired shelves. College students served lunch. Nobody introduced themselves by profession anymore, only by their names. Near the end of that first gathering, my mother walked over carrying a small velvet box. Without making a speech, she handed me Grandpa's silver stethoscope keychain. She had polished it herself. This time she didn't place it beside photographs of doctors. She placed it in my hand. Nothing else needed to be said. Emma now serves on the board of our nonprofit, helping create educational programs for children recovering from long hospital stays. She often jokes that medicine helped them survive. Education helped them dream again. Whenever I watch her working beside volunteers from every imaginable profession, I think about how small our family's world once was. 9 years separated the daughter my mother rejected from the woman she finally met again at a wedding. The strange thing is that neither of us returned as the same person. If there's one lesson hidden inside those 9 years, it's this. A family begins to heal the moment it stops measuring worth by titles and starts measuring it by who never stops